It's really a pleasure to lead this workshop today. It's going to be very informal. So first of all, I would like to introduce myself. I am the artist who has created this project and who is leading a signing space. And probably you read a few articles on the media about that. But I thought at this stage of the project, it would be great to have a Q&A with all of you who register for this workshop to maybe ask questions or share remarks or just talk about your experience so far. And I would really love to hear if you have participated, for example, in the decoding process, if you are in Discord, if you're trying to decode the data, what are your skills in this field, and so on. So if you like, we can go and have a quick round of introduction. If any of you wants to start with a very brief introduction on who are you, where are you connecting from, and if you have why you have an interest in SETI, for example, or whatever other information you wish to give us, the rest of the group, to start working together today.
Okay. I've always been interested in SETI since I can remember. I went to grad school at Cornell. I knew Carl Sagan and Frank Drake. My career took me elsewhere, but at the end, I ended up here in California. I now live in Los Gatos, and it's a few miles from where the SETI Institute's located. For the last 12 years that I worked, I went to the weekly seminars that the SETI Institute held. And once I retired, I volunteered to start working at the SETI Institute. I spend time up at the Allentown Telescope Array several times a year and working on some of the circuitry and things there. So I'm once again getting really involved in it. I was not there when they downloaded the message. I was traveling for other purposes. And so I've downloaded the file now, but I haven't had a chance to approach it. I've spent lots of my career trying to figure out how to do encoding and decoding of signals. So I'm very interested to attack it.
Thank you, Michael. That's really interesting. Are you a radio astronomer yourself, or a radio engineer?
Yeah, yeah, and now I am. I spent most of my life doing solid state physics and electrical engineering type things.
Okay, thank you. Who is next?
I've come at this from a totally creative arts point of view. I don't really have any science background, but I found it fascinating what you had chosen to take on and to create. So that's kind of my angle on it all. I also downloaded the message, and yeah, I'm going to try and decode it in whatever way.
Great, thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Hi, Catherine. Yes.
Hi. So I am an author and journalist, and I write mostly for kids about science. And I'm working on two projects right now, actually, that involve SETI and the idea of what might happen if a UFO were to reach Earth, or if a message were to reach us. And so just as is my research for these books, this is just the perfect opportunity for me to learn about what would happen, because you guys are actually simulating this. So that's why I'm following it. I'm not really planning to try to translate the message myself, but I am very eager to see how other people are doing it. And I think it'll really help inform my, my research for my writing projects.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
It's so wonderful for me to actually learn about the people who join these events, who are participating remotely, and knowing actually how humans are experiencing what we have been creating. Anyone wants to introduce themselves to the group? Please go next.
I'm Joseph Mente. Day job is I work at a software company in San Francisco in the IT and network engineering department. My interest here is, I've been interested in SETI for a long time, but I'm working on a video game that basically simulates a message similar to this. So my main interest here is trying to see what people are trying to attempt and making sure I can include that type of stuff. So.
Okay, great. Anyone else? I see, actually, I will. I think we know each other. Hi, it's so great to have you in the group.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for having me. I'm eagerly watching the decoding process and very captivated by this whole process and this art event. And I'm excited to work on the interpreting stage. And but I think part of the experience I'm finding right now is the anticipation is actually part of the experience, and the patience, the waiting, the anticipation really ignites the imagination. And so right now there's so much possibilities happening, and so I think that's a vital part that I wouldn't necessarily have known had I not been kind of participating in this. And I'm sure that would be that would attend receiving a message that was from another civilization, potentially, there would be that same waiting period. And I think it would be, like Dickinson said, dwelling in possibility, be an exciting stage. So thanks.
Thank you. We have a few more people who haven't introduced themselves. Feel free to go ahead if you want. Oh, hi, Sherry. Okay, that's fine. You can interact with us by chat. And it's great to know you are also interested in the arts. Wonderful. I'm also personally, I'm an artist, I'm a radio operator, but the first stage of the decoding process is highly technical. And I wasn't able to follow much of it. I was really impressed by the level of collaboration amongst the members joining the Discord platform. And it has been really a pleasure to see that people are actually working with each other to try and decode the signal. So the first stage, from what I understood and from what my collaborators have been informing me, was mostly involving radio engineers, and then the computer scientists joined in as the radio language was somehow cracked. And at this stage, we are at this very promising stage that you mentioned, Will, this interesting moment when even computer scientists, they need to apply some creative thinking in order to proceed, because at this stage, it's a hybrid moment when you also need to understand semiotics, which is also what we are looking at. So I put in the chat the link to the web page where we are posting daily updates on the decoding process happening on Discord. So if you go to, I think the interesting part, because I find it interesting because also I'm a visual artist, and for me this work on Discord is also a form of net art. So it is not just text, but also very visual. And regardless of whether you understand or not the computer language, I think it is really interesting to see how these signs are created in the reverse process of creation. So we already created something and people are trying to create it backwards. And that is a very interesting process, I find. So I am very captivated by the quantity of signs that have been emerging in these on this platform, and that are really about human mind trying to make sense of the data, and not just from the technical perspective, but also imaginative perspective. So I would really recommend, if you have time, to scroll back through the decoding process. There is some really interesting visual material there. But if we look at image 711, we see some images emerging from the data. So up to this point, the decoders have been working with quite a large amount of data that contained a lot of noise, a lot of also information that typically you will get in a space communication. So we are using this material because if we ever received an extraterrestrial signal, the scientist wouldn't know exactly where the noise ends and where the actual message begins. So it is actually a very difficult process to separate the two things. So this is quite faithful to what would happen if the scientific community really decided to share in an open source format the signal from a potential extraterrestrial intelligence. We would receive this data and people will try to just sort through the data to see if there is any gold amongst all these grains of sands. But also the grains of sands are very interesting because they offer a lot of possible directions. So what I've been seeing on this course is that these data have been also offering groups several directions for the decoding process. Some groups have decided to go in one direction, other groups in other directions. So that is actually quite interesting to experience. And if you go to page 811, the following slide on the message page on the website, you see someone called Batch Drake who posted this, which I believe is the visualization of some data contained in the signal. But it doesn't matter, you don't need to be technically minded. I think this is a really interesting also visual, just a very interesting semantic object per se. So I'm looking at it just as from the perspective of a visual artist. Finally, there was, after a long discussion, there was someone who posted this photo of the Pleiades because there were some people who identified some dots in this simulated message. So now there is some focus on trying to understand what these dots might be. And one of the directions that a few groups are taking are, for example, Monday, 29th of May, you see that the summary of the decoding process is that the participants continue to analyze the data in the three APIDs, which are packet types, which are considered the most likely to contain the message. So amongst all this large amount of data, this group found they found something which they think, oh, this could contain something interesting. One of the three APIDs, the one numbered as 0/17, has received the most attention. When arranged in a particular way, some of the data in these packets form a square image of size 256×256, with dots arranged in some clouds. What is this? The Pleiades, another star cluster pointing to the location of the extraterrestrial intelligence. These are some of the ideas considered, but no one is quite sure. This image has been labeled as the best candidate found so far by some participants. But meanwhile, the effort continues to explore other parts of the data and to find other possible ways to interpret the APID 0/17 packets. So at this point, I find really fascinating that people are starting to see something, and immediately the human mind is compelled to make sense of these. So these dots maybe could be the Pleiades. Who knows? What are these extraterrestrial beings trying to tell us? Again, there was some updates today on the decoding process. A large part of the conversation still revolves around the star map. Could it be pulsars, so a particular type of stars, active galactic nuclei, or molecular clouds? Maybe it is related to the spacecraft star tracker. This spacecraft has some cameras that look at the stars to find how the spacecraft is oriented. In parallel, there are attempts to visualize the same data in a completely different way. So there are people who look at these dots and think, oh, maybe these dots are actually the data gathered by the spacecraft while moving into space and tracing its position in space by looking at the stars. So there are, at the moment, different interpretations. So I thought it would be interesting to just start from what the highly technically skilled people have somehow found in this amount of data. They found something. We don't know yet if it is the simulated extraterrestrial message. It is still a process. It's an ongoing process, and it is quite complex. I think if we ever received an extraterrestrial message, it would be extremely challenging to understand its content. And it potentially could be an endless process. We might never be able to really find a message, or we might never be able to assign a meaning to it. So I thought today would be great to divide this group into smaller groups and maybe have you, I don't know if there are people who joined a little bit later, so apologies if not everyone managed to introduce themselves to the team, but you will have the chance to do that now in the smaller groups. And in the smaller groups, we're going to discuss the possible interpretation of these data that have been found by the people decoding the scientific data. So you're welcome to approach this with a very creative mindset. So I know there are some people here who are artists or affiliated with the arts. So that's great, because that's exactly the approach we're going to take. We're really going to look at these and think, what could these dots that have been found could mean? So what would it mean for you, or how would you make a story from this? So you can brainstorm ideas, and after we, each group, it would be great if each group reports to the others to share their thoughts. And what I think I will like to suggest as a possible follow-up of this exercise is that if you like, you can write a text or something about the decoding process from the creative perspective that we can also share with the global community on our website, and seeing how now from the decoding process, the technical process, gradually we're moving towards the intellectual and creative and poetic interpretation, which is what gradually we will be moving towards. I would like to say a few words about the title of this project, A Sign in Space. I always found the work of Italo Calvino very interesting, because he approaches science as a novelist from a perspective of humor, of humility, and I think sometimes this perspective is very needed in a scientific process. And especially this novel, A Sign in Space, was written between 1963 and 1964, which was exactly the same years when the science of semantics was also emerging. And Calvino was responding exactly to the development of semantics. So if you just Google semantics, the first meaning you get is that, semiotics is the study of the use of a symbolic communication. Semiotics can include signs, logos, gestures, and other linguistic and non-linguistic communication methods. As a word, semiotics derives from the Greek semiotikos, which describes the action of interpreting signs. So the science of semiotics has become really important, especially in our contemporary society. And this will be very important now in our interpretation process. And if we ever received an extraterrestrial signal, we will need to apply this scientific approach and also artistic approach to it. So I just want to read few short paragraphs of this novel, which I find very poetic. And what I also found really compelling about this story is that Calvino, not just in this novel, but in general in all the novels in Cosmicomics, he bring the reader to imagine the impossible. For example, this novel is about this imaginary being, which has a very unusual name. Its name is QFWFQ. And this imaginary being, we don't know if it's a female or male or any other gender, is the very first being in the entire cosmos. And that is already a thought that is almost beyond the human imagination. So imagining to be the very first being and the only being in the whole cosmos. And in addition to that, this imaginary being also somehow feeling really lonely and trying to overcome their loneliness, decides to create a sign, so to draw a sign in the vastness of space. And so again, Calvino brings us to imagine what would be like to draw the very first sign, to even conceive the idea of creating a sign. So this is just going back to the very primordial idea of experiencing the necessity of creating a sign, which I think is really poetic and also kind of pushes the limit of what we can imagine almost as humans. To there is, for example, another novel in this collection where Calvino imagines what would be like to be the very first cell. So if how the very first cell must have been feeling, so to speak. So probably it must have been feeling as the whole universe. So being the very first cell would equal to be the entire universe. And so I think that extreme thought process, thought experiments, I find that extremely interesting. So I will briefly read these paragraphs. Situated in the external zone of the Milky Way, the sun takes about 200 million years to make a complete revolution of the galaxy. Right, that's how long it takes, not a day less, QFWFQ said. Once, as I went past, I drew a sign at a point in space, just so I could find it again 200 million years later, when we went by the next time around. What sort of sign? It's hard to explain, because if I say sign to you, you immediately think of a something that can be distinguished from a something else. But nothing could be distinguished from anything there. You immediately think of a sign made with some implement or with your hands, and then when you take the implement or your hands away, the sign remains. But in those days, there were no implements or even hands or teeth or noses, all things that came along afterwards, a long time afterwards. As to the form a sign should have, you say it's not problem, because whatever form it may be given, a sign only has to serve as a sign, that is, be different or else the same as other signs. Here again, it's easy for you young ones to talk, but in that period, I didn't have any example to follow. I couldn't say I'll make it the same or I'll make it different. There were no things to copy. Nobody knew what a line was, straight or curved, or even a dot or a protuberance or a cavity. I conceived the idea of making a sign. That's true enough, or rather, I conceived the idea of considering a sign as something that I felt like making. So when at that point in space and not in another, I made something, meaning to make a sign, it turned out that I really had made a sign after all. In other words, considering it was the first sign ever made in the universe, or at least in the circuit of the Milky Way, I must admit it came out very well. Visible? What a question. Who had eyes to see with in those days? Nothing had ever been seen by anything. The question never even arose. Recognizable? Yes, beyond any possibility of error, because all the other points in space were the same, indistinguishable, and instead this one had the sign on it. So as the planets continued their revolutions and the solar system went on its own, I soon left the sign far behind me, separated from it by the endless fields of space. And I couldn't help thinking about when I would come back and encounter it again, and how I would know it, and how happy it would make me in that anonymous expanse, after I had spent 100,000 light years without meeting anything familiar, nothing for hundreds of centuries, for thousands of millennia. I'll come back, and there it would be in its place. Just as I left it, simple and bare, but with that unmistakable imprint, so to speak, that I had given it. So I think this is a great start for a brainstorming session on the meaning of sign for a potential extraterrestrial intelligence that might not have eyes, for example, might not have the same perception system that we have, or how would this potential extraterrestrial intelligence communicate, make a sign, and would they have the same human need to actually create a sign? Maybe this is something very human. Maybe we as a human species, we have this incredible need to express ourselves, our individuality through these signs and mark space around us with them. But maybe another extraterrestrial civilization might not have that necessity, and that might explain why we have never heard from them. So there are so many possible philosophical questions that could arise from such a radical thought experiment that Calvino presented to us in A Sign in Space. In no way we will be able to exhaust all the philosophical questions around this topic, but it's a way to at least raise some of the relevant questions that you've been discussing in the smaller group and open them up with the larger group. So starting maybe with you, Will.
Thank you. In our group, we started talking about the difficulty of getting outside the human perspective. And we were reflecting on how even among humans looking at the stars in the sky over the millennia, our perspective has changed so dramatically from thinking of it as a two-dimensional plane to now with science as 3 dimensions that we're looking at. And so just really re-emphasizing and underlining how difficult it is to not project our human expectations upon a message we're receiving, and how just decoding it and getting an image like a series of dots is not the same as understanding it and the difficulties that it presents. And then we had a contributor, Rock, who brought up some great points about thinking from the perspective of the potential extraterrestrial civilization sending this message and talking about what would they be willing to give away about themselves, their cautiousness potentially, maybe seeing this as them projecting a historical marker of their existence, and just trying to start to think about from their perspective why they would send this message, how and what they would possibly say, especially without necessarily them having Earth in mind. So I can't say we reached any grand conclusions, but we were really starting to circle around some of the issues and the difficulties, challenges. Yeah.
Any other group that wish to share their findings of this very short period of time?
My group spent a fair amount of time going over basically the same issues as, how do we map our own thought processes onto a process of an alien civilization that we can't even begin to suspect how they think, and what would we do to try and find something in it. Talked about difficulties of communicating even between groups of people on Earth, and then other animal species, like we talked about the killer whales that are apparently communicating with one another, and how we can't figure that out, even how we're going to figure out something on another planet in a far distant sector of the galaxy or beyond.
Yes, there was a brilliant artwork by an artist duo, a video work from 2016. I think it's called The Great Silence, I believe. And it's filmed by the Arecibo radio telescope, and they filmed these parrots who are enigmatically inhabiting this forest surrounding the Arecibo telescope. And they were comparing the scientists who were looking for extraterrestrial signals with these species who was right there next to their labs, and the scientists would pay no attention whatsoever to these birds. So I thought that was a really interesting way to look at the limits of our understanding and our communication. So I think it's also online. You can watch it. It's a 10 minutes film. Any other thoughts that emerged that you think were quite interesting, made you think about this decoding interpretation process, perhaps from a deeper or newer perspective?
Unfortunately, our group, I think there was just three of us in the group, and I think for us, we were talking more about what communication methods we've done previously. The gold disc on Voyager and other signals that have been sent up, and how it would be interpreted should an alien species or an alien race receive them. But we didn't really get a chance to talk about the current project and the current data and stuff like that. It wasn't long enough.
Sorry. Yes. I know this is just a very quick icebreaker to get people into thinking in this way, and to actively participate in the interpretation process. So we will have in the next stage poets, writers from around the world who will initiate this meaning making process. Any more thoughts from other groups? Are you optimistic that we will find a meaning to this message that we created, or even the meaning that we gave to the message might be, even if it's human-made, might be difficult to communicate to other humans?
I'm not sure I'm optimistic, but I'm very hopeful. It's hard to know. Something like this seems to require a breakthrough of perspective, sort of a eureka moment, and those are difficult to to know when those will come. But I'm hopeful that with this open format, where this is a kind of crowdsourcing effort with so many different people and so many coming from diverse backgrounds and different types of minds, that a breakthrough will come.
Well, I think
Yeah.
one of the great benefits of many of the science fiction movies that have addressed this is that they tend to emphasize how long and hard the process may be to figure out what the content of a message is and what's trying to be communicated, and how we can back and forth with whatever that civilization is. And then the other thing that I don't think gets emphasized enough is we're much more likely to receive a message from a great distance that was sent a long time ago, and that the round trip time for any messages may be hundreds of generations. You know, can we as a human race stay dedicated enough to try and do a conversation when it may take many generations to get, you know, each reply back and forth? It's a problem I don't think has been addressed enough.
And also on the back of what you've just said, the possibility, if we do work out a response, is there going to be anybody left on that, you know, to actually receive it when we do manage to be able to send it back? So will that civilization still be there? So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what I find really interesting is that there is also a bit of a paradox within SETI in a way. I mean, so one of the questions that when Cocconi and Drake founded the Science of SETI, one of the questions was, are we alone? And they started this search for extraterrestrial signals. However, finding an extraterrestrial signal doesn't necessarily answer this question, because as you just said, Steve, it doesn't actually say much about the civilization if they are still alive. It could be a civilization that has already extinguished itself. So it might, even receiving the signal might not be enough to actually answer the question that SETI searchers have been looking for. So it requires also a mindset where you know that it is a victory, so to speak, that is only half true.
So, but hi, but so the idea behind this experiment is that and now you are looking for an unintentional message, right? So that adds to the difficulty. So my question rather is, the first SETI needed time from our computers. Maybe now you need brains. I don't know. That's the scope of this experiment.
No, actually, we have a very specific message. We created a very specific message for this project. So, but like all types of artistic language, we are focusing on the interpretation aspect of it. So if you see a painting, for example, it is a painting, an actual painting, but the interpretation of the work varies from person to person, and can even vary from one culture to another, or one linguistic tradition to another. So even if we compare, for example, cultures that read from left to right and right to left, even that is already a form of interpretation that is cultural dependent. So this is really about interpreting, simulating the reception of an extraterrestrial message, interpreting the content that I created together with other researchers. So it's a very specific task. Further remarks, questions? Someone is mentioning dark matter. signal anywhere. Well, actually, in my experience, SETI researchers are very careful to discuss things that are not scientifically solid yet. So all these theories that are very speculative usually are not, well, they are discussed, but not if there is no data, it's of course very hard to continue this type of conversation in the scientific field. But there is some suggestion that there are ideas that have been brainstormed by SETI scientists to think that very advanced extraterrestrial civilizations might be communicating through quantum in quantum form. So we don't have that kind of technology or ability yet, but that would for sure simplify communication and would make it possible even across vast distances. So there are these far-fetched discussions, but yeah, it's all very speculative, of course.
If I might address the questions Elena sort of raised, would it be accidental stuff we pick up or not?
I see.
Given the great distances likely to be involved, unless some spacecraft does come in and orbit the Earth, it's likely to be a deliberate message that they put enough power behind it to broadcast at a huge distance. And unless they know specifically where we are, they're probably broadcasting it in a number of directions. And so if they're taking the time and energy to put that much energy into broadcasting it over a huge distance, they're probably going to actually try to put something meaningful into the message rather than just old episodes of I Love Lucy from television from 70 years ago. And
couldn't agree more. Yeah.
And those signals, by the way, probably I've reached 70, 80 years 70 or 80 light years out into space, but realistically, none of the technology we have on Earth right now, 70 or 80 light years away, could actually detect those messages. So we would either have to get much better detection equipment, or we would have had to broadcast with much more power. That's why when Frank Drake sent his message from Arecibo, he had the most powerful radio transmitter on Earth, and he beamed it in a specific direction so they could concentrate all the power in one direction.
Well, another take on that, though, is that our television signals are much weaker than sort of the military radar signals that we're sending out, which so something I was reading somewhere else. But if I agree that most likely it would be an intentional message, but given what we're currently sending out as humans, like we send out informationless radio beams as our most powerful radio output, and that could be a reason why we haven't found anything for SETI, because it would be like, okay, well, we see blips, but they're not repeated. It's just accidental radar beams looking for missiles or satellites, but they don't have any informational content at all, which would be disappointing, but it's still a signal, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as I said earlier, SETI scientists look just for the signal. They just look for the bip. And they're not concerned about the content. So this is something that we, I think, we want to think that a signal contains a content, but of course that's not necessarily the case. And I think it's something that we developed this idea thanks to science fiction, for sure, and even a first contact scenario might be influenced by all these cultural creations that we've we presented. So films and even this project might have some kind of cultural impact on a potential first contact in the future. So that's the only scenarios we have to base upon our reactions, and so we might be also influenced by these movies like Contact or other cult films that have become part of our collective imagination. I would like to thanks everyone. We can continue the conversation by you remotely participating in the decoding interpretation stage and sending your thoughts. You can share them on Discord. You can send them on the through the submission form on the website, or just send an email to the directly to us leading the project. Thanks, everyone.